All right, students, we are recording. I am recording this lesson from home, so if you hear any noise in the background, just know it's probably my dogs or something going on in my house. All right, so I'm going to record this lesson over two separate videos. There's a lot that goes along with learning about composition, and so I'm going to split it up into two parts. One part will be mostly learning, and the next part will be the practice and activities that you will be doing. And then we'll culminate the lesson with a project that incorporates everything that we just learned about composition and design. So this week, our lesson is about composition. This is a big term, and this is something that my AP students this year really wanted to understand better, and I spent a lot of time teaching them composition, and so I now have a better understanding of what I need to teach y'all so that you come to AP Art better prepared. So this week's lesson, as well as the next 2 weeks of lessons, are really going to be focused on AP Art. So you're going to be learning stuff that, yes, will help you right now with art class, but they also will really become important when you start making art projects for college level things, or if you become an art major, or if you decide to pursue a career in the arts. What we're going to talk about is using the principles of design and how to apply those in a way that make good compositions. All right, so the first thing we're going to do is review. I have a handout for you to follow along during this review. It's a lot of information, so before you go any farther in this video, go to Google Classroom and either copy down the handout into your sketchbook so that you can fill in the notes in your sketchbook as we go, or print out the handout because it's got enough on it that it's actually worth printing if you have a printer at your house. We will go over the elements of art, principles of design, and rules of composition, and that will be to this first video. In the next video and continuing this lesson, we're going to learn about a piece of art. We're going to practice by drawing the compositional devices, and we'll learn what those are at the end of this video. And then you will create your own piece by making an abstract composition with text or numbers. So if you're getting tired of drawing representational things, don't worry, this is your project. All right, so I want you to look at this picture, and before I teach you anything about composition, I want you to think, what do you notice first, or what did you notice first when I clicked on this slide? All right, now I want you to think about that. Maybe make a note of that somewhere, and we'll get back to this picture after we've talked about some of these rules and devices for helping people look at your art. All right, so we're going to review the elements of art and principles of design. Please make sure that you have either written down the stuff from the handout or that you printed those documents and have your sketchbook and have a writing utensil. There's a lot of information here. I mean, a lot of information. This is a super important lesson. And this is another one. I hate that we're doing it at home, but you need to know this going into your other art classes. And even if you don't take any more art classes at the high school level, this is important for everyone who creates art. All right, so let's start with the definition of composition. The placement of arrangement of visual elements in a work of art is its composition. When you're deciding on a composition, you want to ask yourself several things. You want to ask, what is the point of my piece? How can I draw attention to my subject? Your subject can be something more obvious, like a person if you're doing a portrait or a character design, but it can also be something a little bit more esoteric, like an idea, like if you want to do art about anti-war, then how do you show, either how ugly war is, or how do you show how good peace is? Another thing you want to ask yourself is there anything else interesting that I want people to notice? So if you're doing an Alice in Wonderland design, if you have more than one character in the scene, how do you make people look around the whole picture? And then think about, is there anything distracting in the piece that I need to make less distracting? And how can I do that? All right, so art has been studied for centuries, and analysts have discovered similarities in sophisticated art from across mediums and across different cultures. So there are several principles that make art good. Not all art is good, some art is bad. So for art to be considered good, it needs to have at least two or more of these principles used in the artwork. So these are your tools or your rules for designing good art. You don't want to make good art on accident. You want everything that you make to be good, everything, something that could be used by whoever hired you or whoever's buying your art. You want them to, sell it. You want collectors to get it. You want people to sell it in their galleries. So you need to do that on purpose if this is going to be something that you're doing for a living. All right, so while I'm going through these, fill in the handout. There will be little sections for you to write a definition in your own words, and then a little section for you to draw. You can use the images from the PowerPoint as your visual examples, or you can come up with your own. It's totally up to you, but I feel like using the images from the PowerPoint are helpful. So feel free to pause the PowerPoint at any point or pause this video at any point so that you can fill in those boxes. The boxes are not in order, so I want you to be looking at the whole thing while I'm going through it. All right, so elements. Applying rules to the simple ingredients for art. So those elements of art we covered in Art 1 are very basic, but there are some next level things that you can do with those now that we have learned a little bit more about art. Excuse me. All right, so leading lines is the next level of using line in your artwork. So effective leading lines make the viewer enter the art, see the focal point, and then linger. You don't want people to look at your art for 2 seconds and then stop. If you spend a lot of time on it, you want people to look at it. If you're making an advertisement, you want people to see what you're trying to show them. So a lot of times you're going to do this through implied lines. Think of things like rivers, roads, horizons, fences, bridges. If people are looking at something, that would be an implied line, or if people are pointing at something, that's a more obvious implied line. Images will, viewers will follow a line through an image, and that will take them to the focal point. Also, think about when you're designing an image that most people are going to look at it from the bottom left up to the right, because most people read from left to right. Now, if your audience is maybe a more Eastern audience, they read a different direction. So you would have to compose your ads and your images and your art differently depending on your audience. But most of the time, most people in the Western world are going to look at things from left to right. A good composition is going to bring the viewer back into your picture and not out of your picture. So you never want to make people leave the page, quote unquote, because then they probably won't come back and look at your focal point. All right, so think about this piece right here, the creation of Adam, and think about leading lines. Where are the people looking? Where are they pointing? Is there anything that makes you leave the page? Hopefully not. Hopefully you start on the left with Adam, and then you go up to God and you go around to the people around him and then go back to Adam. So that's a very simple, very obvious leading line that Michelangelo used in this painting. Here's another example of leading lines. So how the path is going back to the house, it's kind of blurry, and then the house is in focus. It's a very good leading line. And that handout on the other side of the page, if you look up Andrew Loomis, like I talked about a few weeks ago, he is a fantastic illustrator. He has made a book. A lot of times you can find his book for free online. And he has all kinds of layouts and just really good descriptions of how to do this in illustration. So if you're thinking of doing a drawing portfolio or a 2D design portfolio, he is someone that you need to know about, and you need to look up his handouts and information. Here is another example of leading line. So look at the girl's leg. It should kind of bring you to her. Then we typically would notice her face next, and then probably look through the rest of the picture because of the bar behind her head. Okay, so the next element that we need to talk about is color theory, and I'm going to talk about the 60-30-10 rule. So this is one of those things where you have been told about color, but color is huge. And so another big thing that you need to think about when choosing colors in your artwork is that you want to limit yourself to only 3 colors. You don't want to include every single color in every single piece. And usually when you're trying to make a design, you want to think about a 60-30-10 rule. So 60% of your design should be your main color, then 30% of your design should be the second color, and then 10% of your design should be an accent color. You should never use more than 5 colors in any kind of composition. If you use more than that, it becomes overwhelming to the viewer, it becomes distracting, and it looks like you're an amateur. If you want a helpful reminder on the 60-30-10 rule, think of someone wearing a suit like the picture right there. 60% of what they're wearing is the one color of the suit, then 30% of what they're wearing is the shirt, and then the tie and sometimes little ascot are the accent colors. If you need more than 3 colors to do a design, use tints and shades of the 3 colors that you've already chosen. So if I use green, orange, and violet in a composition, I can use like light green and I can use a really dark green, but I don't want to also throw in pink and something that's not part of my original color scheme. All right, the next thing that we're going to talk about, the next element is space. And so there are 3 main things that I want you to apply into your art that have to do with space. The first one is grounds. You want to make sure that you include the foreground, middle ground, and background to an image. That creates depth, okay? So grounds is the way that we create depth, and that's always our goal when we're thinking about space in art. Another thing you want to remember is to use atmospheric perspective. So things in the background should look hazier or lighter, just like in that print down at the bottom where the mountains in the background are a very light gray color. And then you want to place objects that are closer farther down on the page. If something is supposed to be closer, it shouldn't be at the top of the page. That's where the background is. There's another example of having things in the foreground. All right, the next thing that you want to think about is positive and negative space. So you want to think about the relationship between the two, and this is true in 3D art as well. A lot of times you can use negative space as a symbol. Little negative space or cropping very closely is going to make the subject very imposing. And then leaving lots of negative space is going to make the subject look very small or isolated. So the symbolism in this picture is that the man should look, kind of frail and isolated. And that's why the artist included so much negative space. Negative space is a very interesting device. You can do a lot of interesting things with it. So the picture on the left is we can't see her hands. They're not actually drawn, but the negative space of the outline suggests what they are. You also want to give your subjects a breathing room. So how this girl right here, it's a very minimalist photograph. There's a white background. She's wearing a white outfit. But then there's also all this negative space around her, so it feels very calm and serene. If it was cropped very closely around her, it would look awkward. This is another example of breathing room. So this, the artist wants us to think about the girl walking. And so they have left a lot of space in front of her so that we can imagine almost like action happening and her walking into that space. All right, the next idea is overlapping. So this is more of a rule. You want to vary space by changing the angle and size of objects. But when you're arranging something like a still life or 2 figures in a drawing, you never want things to be just touching. So like that first example right there, that is awkward. That makes the viewer uncomfortable and it's not a good look for your art. You also don't want something to be just touching on the edge. If you're ever looking at your teacher's PowerPoint presentations and it's kind of awkward, like when text is like just touching something that it looks like it's not supposed to, that's because that's actually a bad design choice. You also can kind of judge your art by squinting and looking at the arrangement of objects and making sure that the silhouette makes sense to you. And then you want to create unity by repeating things like color or value. When you're trying to arrange things, you either want them to be clearly apart or clearly overlapping, but never just touching. Same thing on the edges of your picture. You either want something to be clearly out of the frame or clearly in the frame, but never like touching the frame. All right, the next thing is point of view. So there are two main points of view that I'm going to hit right here, but there are many more. So very point of view to make your art more interesting. Always showing the subject straight on is boring, okay? If you're practicing something, sure, go for it. But if you are trying to make an interesting piece of art for, let's say, your AP portfolio, then experiment with different points of view. So things like worm's eye view, where you're looking from the worm's perspective up at your subject, or the bird's eye view where you're above your subject looking down. Those are much more interesting. And here's two photographs illustrating those two different points of view. There are also many different variations of those, but just moving around the subject and showing us different angles is going to be more interesting. All right, so we're going to move on from the elements of art into the principles of design. And so we're going to apply these to composition. Some of us have learned these already. Some of us have not really learned these already. Hopefully you've at least heard of most of them, but this is where we're really going to get into the meat of today's lesson. All right, so there are several principles of composition or design. We call them principles of design in Art 1, but they're really principles of composition, or how to arrange your images. So we're going to talk about unity, balance, movement, rhythm, emphasis, contrast, pattern, and proportion, and we're going to kind of hit a couple other things in there. All right, so unity and harmony, those are your ultimate goal when creating art. You want to think about, do all the parts of the composition feel as if they belong together, or does something feel like it is stuck in awkwardly, or does something feel out of place? All of the images on the screen right here are good examples of unity, and we'll talk more. I'm about to steal my own thunder, but anyways, they did that through repetition in all of these pictures. All right, the next thing you want to think about is balance. So we have talked about symmetrical versus asymmetrical. Symmetrical things make the viewer feel calm. Asymmetrical will create a feeling of movement. So that picture on the left with the abstract shapes at the top, that one is an example of asymmetrical. So it should look like there's a little bit of movement, or you should feel a little bit uneasy looking at it. And then the picture on the right of the saints, that should make you feel calm because it's very symmetrical. You want to balance things like size, value, color, the intensity of the color, shape, like what types of shapes, whether they're organic or geometric, and then the position of things. So all of those are things that you're trying to balance when you're designing your artwork. Okay, movement. This is one of those advanced things that good artists can do. And you can do this through several different things. You can arrange objects to show movement. You can position figures in a certain way so that they look like they're moving. You can suggest movement through line. You can also make the viewer's eye move by using leading lines like we talked about earlier. Rhythm is another way to create movement in your piece. So art can have rhythm or an underlying beat. Think about music. But it's going to lead and pace the eye. Look at this picture below. Certain colors are repeated. The same square shape is repeated over and over, so it should draw your eye around the piece at a certain speed. And that is an example of using rhythm in art. This is another example of rhythm. So I can almost imagine the beat of the boat as it moves up the river because I can see the ripples in the water. Another way that you can do rhythm in your art is by using pattern. So a pattern is an underlying structure that organizes surfaces, and it is consistent and regular. If you use a repeating unit of shape, form, color, any of those things in a design, you will have a pattern. And pattern is one of those things that is very similar to repetition, rhythm, movement, pattern. All those kind of overlap and intermingle with each other, but you can use a pattern in isolation. So it is its own principle of design. Emphasis. Emphasis is when you lead the viewer's eye to the most important thing in the picture. If you do not use emphasis in your art, then the eye will feel lost. It will wander around your picture. Usually what people do if you don't have good emphasis is they just stop looking at your art. And that's always awful to the artist. So what you want to think about is what is your point when you're making the art? What do you want people to notice, or what do you want people to think about? And then you can emphasize it through things like color or value or size, or by using leading lines to make people look at that focal point. Okay, contrast is the arrangement of opposite elements in a piece. It should create visual interest, excitement, or drama. So think about these examples like light versus dark colors, rough versus smooth textures, large versus small shapes. All of those contrasts will create excitement in the viewer as they view your piece. You can also approach this from more conceptual ideas. So you can put two things together that we don't usually see together, like someone very old next to someone very young, or think about ways that you can kind of defy convention or break the rules, and that would be a good example of using contrast. All right, so proportion and scale is the next principle of design. Proportion refers to the relative size of parts of a whole. So think about the elements within your piece, and then think about the size relationship between an object and the human body. We're always going to compare things to ourselves. So if we're looking at a huge painting of a little bird, it's going to make us feel very small. You want to play with that when you're creating art. You want to think about psychologically what can you do to people by playing with proportion and scale. All right, so that's it for the principles of design. We're now going to move into composition specifically. So we're going to learn these graphic design concepts, and whether you're doing drawings, sculptures, or designs, these are super important rules to know and to use to your advantage. All right, so the first thing you want to remember is that odd numbers are always better. Our eyes try to make pairs. So if you put an even number of things in an image or composition, then the eye gets bored quickly because it pairs everything up. If you have an odd number of elements, then the eye is constantly switching back and forth between different things, trying to make a pair, but it can't. So it adds more visual interest to your art, which is always your goal. The next thing that you want to think about is cropping. So if you want to direct the viewer to look at a certain thing, think about zooming in very close and having some things out of the frame. Just like the wheel right there in that first image, we still know that it's a wheel even though we can't see the whole picture. We kind of mentally complete the rest of it, and that actually makes the brain work a little bit more and look at the picture and think about the picture longer. This is another example of cropping. So look at the different objects. We don't have to see the whole bed to know that the boy is in front of it. We don't have to see the entire picture up here in the corner. So cropping things is a very effective way to keep our focus on the right subject. If I had his whole room behind him, I might be distracted from what the boy's doing. Make sure that you focus the viewer on the right thing. And here's another example in photography. So like right here, I think the subject is the girl. She is very obvious. She's in a white dress, but then that house in the background is a little bit distracting, and then all that grass in front of her is a little bit distracting. So cropping the image is going to make it where I notice the girl, and she is more clearly the subject of this picture. All right, the other thing you want to think about with cropping is the guillotine effect. So sometimes if you want people to focus on an outfit or a detail or an object, you don't want to include a person's head. We are, as humans, are always going to be attracted to other humans and their face and their eyes. So if you cut off the eyes of something, or if you cut off the head of someone, it's going to make the viewer focus on the other things. If this couple, if I could see their heads, I would be more focused on their faces. Because of this, I'm more focused on their hands. Okay, so that's called the guillotine effect. Here's another example. Look at this picture. In this version of the picture, I am very much drawn to the man. Look at the leading lines going in towards him. And then my eyes bounce around between his face and the hat. And I just keep looking at that part. I'm not really looking at the other details. But if I'm a fashion designer and I want someone to look at his clothes, then I might want to crop the picture like that. In this picture, I'm much more focused on his clothing. I start at his boots and I move all the way up to his outfit, and then I keep looking at all the details in his outfit. So that is another example of the guillotine effect. Framing, another thing that you want to think of instead of cropping is framing. So in painting and a lot in photography, you want to use other things in the image as a frame around your subject. So not like a literal frame around the outside, but something within your piece that can frame it. So in that picture on the left, you see a man in a window. That window acts as a frame so that I focus on the man instead of the train that he's inside. Then in the painting on the right side, I see the cathedral because the trees are framing it, and I like kind of zero in and focus on the light portion between the dark trees. So that is an example of a partial frame, because like the trees are actually cut off at the top of the image, but because they kind of suggest roundness, my brain once again wants to complete that image and make a frame. All right, so we're going to talk about a couple very important rules for doing composition. So this is, I think, the first thing on your handout is what we're about to get to. So look at these images right here. Which of these images is the most interesting to you? What about this image right here? So between those images and this image right here, which one is the most interesting to you? Now, hopefully when I showed you these three images, you thought they're about all the same, because they are compositionally about the same. Now, the two darker ones are probably a little bit more compelling. And the one on the left, to me, is more visually interesting just because of the deep greens. But the one in the middle has a hand. And then the one on the end has complementary colors. So you could make an argument for all three of these being equally interesting. Then in this image right here, this should quite literally and figuratively blow the other ones away. There is a reason this image is better. There's actually two things that you could say. You might say that this image is more interesting because there's a figure in the background. But remember, the picture that we just looked at before had a hand in the bottom. We barely even noticed the hand. In this one, even though she's blurry, and in the last picture the hand was in focus, she's a lot more compelling. There's a little bit of mystery there. Once again, my brain is trying to complete the image. Another thing this image does is it follows the rule of thirds. So the rule of thirds is one of the main rules in art and photography. The human eye naturally gravitates to intersection points that occur when an image is split into thirds. So what you want to do when you're trying to do the rule of thirds, and this is what photographers are doing all the time, but you should also be doing this when you're designing a painting or a drawing, is you want to divide it in thirds across and then up and down as well. Then that gives you 4 intersection points. So that little section in the middle, each one of those intersections in the middle of your piece are good places to put your subject. So it gives you 4 different places you can put your subject, but that's going to make the piece more interesting. Look at these examples. This is an example of a very centered picture. Now, because she is tilted, technically it has the rule of thirds a little bit. If you get a little bit deeper into this concept, we're interested in looking at eyes. So I kind of ignore the rest of her face and focus on the eye that's in that rule of thirds intersection. So the one on the right of the picture. But then look at this picture. That is a better photograph. Look at them next to each other. This one, you know, the one on the left might be used as a headshot because it's a cropped up closer picture of her face, but the one on the right is a better, more interesting image. Let's show you another example. All right, so this one right here, the way that it is cropped, there is not a very good focal point. So I'm going to look at the girl, but my eye actually gets a little bit lost and confused because her eye is not, the eye that's closer to us is not in one of those intersections. Look at this one though. Oops. All right, on this one, it does follow the rule of thirds. Her head is in one of those intersections. So because I have more room to look, it gives me a good spot for my eye to go when I look at this image. The image on the left is a better photograph. This is another example of the rule of thirds. When you're doing a landscape and composing it, you want to put your subject, or the house in this one, on one of those intersections in the grid. This is another example. And then all of these are great if you want to add something else. Like what if I wanted to put something on the wall, or if I wanted to add text? Using the rule of thirds is always preferable. Imagine this vase and the leaves in the center of the page. It would be awkward and less interesting to look at. So a lot of times you're attracted to things that follow the rule of thirds, whether you're aware of it or not. All right, the next rule when you're designing things, this one gets a little bit more intellectual. And this one is the golden mean. It is also called the golden ratio, the golden rule, the golden proportion. So just as long as it has golden in it, you know, it's all the same thing. But the golden ratio is a special number. It corresponds to 1.618, you know, I'm shortening it there. But that number is said to make the most visually pleasing compositions. It is found in nature pretty often, and it is also called the Fibonacci sequence. So maybe you've heard of that before in science or math. But let me move my little icon right there. Okay, so if you look right there, that is a basic example of the Fibonacci sequence, or the golden mean. And that is an example of it found in nature. Those are pretty much spot on, but let me show you some other examples. All right, so if you think about that number sequence, okay, if I am following that number sequence and dividing it and doing the math behind it, then there is a certain ratio of the way that things should relate to each other. And another thing in nature that follows that ratio are trees. So let me compare the shell to the trees. If you look at the shell, the biggest section of the shell is that first ratio. And then if you divide the ratio by the golden number, or the golden ratio, then you get the next size, or the next section. Excuse me. Then if you continue to divide, you get smaller and smaller sections. And then right here in the center, where it kind of bends in on itself, that is the focal point. Like I said, this is getting a little bit crazy. It's getting a little too mathy for me. But if you look at trees, the way that they're arranged, if you want your trees to look more realistic and more natural, then you want to follow the same ratios of the size in your trees. So they should get like smaller and more spread out. So that was super interesting. You can also look at things like nebula and hurricanes, and the amount of seeds and the way that they're spread out in the center of flowers. All of those are going to follow that same ratio, and then they're going to have focal points. So if you look, the biggest collection of stars is right there in that golden mean focal point. the eye of the hurricane is right there and that golden mean focal point. So doing that in your art, or putting your focal point in that little golden area, and then having things arranged where you have a very intense cluster of things close to it, and then it gets more and more spread out, farther out, and farther away from your focal point. If you follow that in your composition, then it is very naturally pleasing to your audience, and they don't even know why. They don't know what you did, but you can actually manipulate that as an artist when you're creating pieces. There's some famous artists that use the golden ratio or the golden mean in their work. If you look at, oh, I'm sorry, I skipped myself a little bit. The human face actually follows the golden mean as well. So when I was talking about the rule of thirds earlier, and I said, you know, like pictus eye, oh, pictus eye, it's because it follows actually the golden ratio as well. Animals actually follow this as well. The dolphin in this example shows it. There were several other like insects and things like that, but I felt like the dolphin one was very easy to understand. All right, the famous artist that I was getting to is Da Vinci. So in his man here, that is supposed to be the ideal form, it actually follows the golden ratio. And if you look at the Mona Lisa, it follows the golden ratio as well, not only in the way that she's composed, but also in value. All right, so once again, when you're composing something like a landscape, you want to use the spiral. Then the focal point is that little red square right there. So that would be where you want to put your subject. And then where it is divided right here, it's not divided, you know, in half or thirds exactly. That line right there should actually be your horizon. And if you look at it compared to the Mona Lisa, it's pretty dang close. If you see the horizon, you see the focal point. This would be the same thing upside down. Without the spiral on top of it, you would actually see the light between the rocks, and that is the focal point. We've also got the leading line of the shooting star coming into it. So that photograph follows the golden mean as well. A lot of Greek architecture follows the golden mean, so we think that they knew about this like even before their mathematicians discovered it. But if you look at the proportions on the Colosseum, it follows the golden mean. If you look at the proportions on you know, several other buildings like that, you'll see the golden mean as well. All right. The golden mean layouts are the ones right here. This is actually on the handout if you were able to print it. If you were not able to print it, sketch these out in your sketchbook. These are things that you need to be referring to from here on out when you're making your art. And you want to arrange things where they either, your focal point and your different elements of your piece need to follow one of these different layouts or designs. We'll talk more about compositional devices, but basically I'm throwing a lot of different layouts at you that you need to be using. So sometimes you do this on accident and your art looks really good and you don't know why. But now that you're aware of it, you can do this on purpose every single time. All right, so the thing I'm going to close with today are compositional devices. So these are ways that artists lay out their paintings. Like I've been saying, and hopefully you will internalize this, good composition is planned, okay? It should not be on accident. When I am an amateur, I accidentally do the right thing every once in a while. And so if I'm a photographer or an amateur photographer, I take a ton of photographs. And every once in a while I have one good one. But I don't know why it's good, but I can tell it's good. That's why you can show your art to people and they can look at them and be like, wow, that one's really good. You can usually agree on what is good because it follows these rules. But now you can actually plan to hit the mark every single time because you know what the elements of art are supposed to be doing, you know what the principles of design are supposed to be doing, and you know some of those compositional rules. These are compositional devices. And so what I want you to do right now is I'm going to read them. While I'm reading them, write them down. So if you go to the last page of those printouts, it has a 16 box grid. And then above each box, there's like a little section. In that little section, I want you to write these 16 compositional devices. And then the next time that I the next time that you watch a video, next time that I teach you, but anyways, the next time you watch a video from me, it will be me explaining the different compositional devices and going through what they look like. And then we'll look at a piece of art, and then I'll talk about your project. So let me end with these, and I'm going to read those while you write them. So the first one is diagonal line. The second one is tunnel. The third one is silhouette. The fourth one is pattern. The fifth one is steelyard. The sixth one is balanced scales. The seventh one is circular. The eighth one is compound curve. The ninth one is pyramid. The 10th one is cross. They named it after me. Just kidding, they didn't. The 11th one is radiating line. The 12th one is rectangular. The 13th one is suspended steelyard. Got that again. 14th one is 3-spot, odd numbers. 15th one is 3 leading lines, and then 16th one is group mass. So right now, these probably don't make a lot of sense to you, but after I go over them and show you some examples in the next video, hopefully they will make sense. Some of these you already use. Some of them you appreciate in other people's art, but you didn't know what they were using. So these compositional devices are going to help you know how to arrange your pieces or how to compose your pieces. So when I say something has good composition, usually it's using one of these devices. So this really is going to be a handy cheat sheet in AP Art. So whatever piece of paper or whatever sketchbook you put these in and you draw your examples in, keep up with that, because that's going to be very important in the upcoming projects and going into next school year or your next art class. All right, that's it for now. I'm going to let you go, but go ahead and either watch the other video right away or tune in tomorrow to see the rest of this lesson.